At 5:48 in the morning, local time, on April 2nd, 2026, the silence of the Hecate Strait was obliterated. Deep beneath the freezing waters of the north coast of British Columbia, the Earth's crust didn't just slip. It fractured with a violence that hasn't been witnessed in this corridor for generations. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake, a monstrous release of kinetic energy, erupted along the Queen Charlotte Fault, approximately 120 kilometers offshore from the city of Prince Rupert. This was not a subtle tremor. This was a catastrophic failure of the boundary between the Pacific and North American plates. While the 200,000 inhabitants of the surrounding regional districts were still in their beds, the seafloor was being torn apart at a depth of 35 kilometers. Within seconds, the energy released began its relentless march toward the Canadian coastline, crossing the deep-sea trenches at speeds exceeding 8 kilometers per second. This is not a slow-motion geological process. This is a high-velocity assault happening in real time. What scientists at Natural Resources Canada observed in the data stream within the first 60 seconds changed everything they thought they knew about the stability of the northern shelf. The rupture was shallow, raw, and terrifyingly efficient at moving the water column above it. As the primary waves, the P waves, slammed into the rocky foundations of Haida Gwaii and the mainland, the secondary S waves followed, carrying the bulk of the destructive power. In the coastal hubs of Terrace and Kitimat, the ground motion was powerful enough to wake the entire population, sending a chilling realization through the province. The clock, which had been ticking for decades in silence, had finally run out of time. This was no longer a theoretical exercise for emergency management BC. This was a fight for survival against a geological powerhouse that treats reinforced concrete like brittle glass. The scale of the event was immediately upgraded as sensors from the Geological Survey of Canada's seismic network began to peak and clip, unable to register the sheer intensity of the local acceleration. Right now, as the dust begins to rise from collapsed timber frame structures and the first sirens pierce the morning air, the data paints a grim picture of a region pushed past its breaking point. The energy propagation was not contained. It radiated southward toward Vancouver Island and northward toward the Alaskan Panhandle, turning the entire Pacific Northwest into a vibrating drum. This is the moment geologists have feared, a major shallow crustal rupture in a zone where the infrastructure was never designed for this level of sustained, high-frequency shaking. The chronology of the disaster reveals a terrifying efficiency in the Earth's ability to dismantle human engineering. At exactly 5:48:12 a.m., the Geological Survey of Canada's seismic monitoring station in Sandspit, Haida Gwaii, registered the first P-wave arrival. The signal was so violent, it immediately saturated the local high-gain sensors. 12 seconds later, the S waves, the secondary shearing waves, struck the coast of the islands, moving the ground with a peak acceleration that defied previous regional models. By 5:49:05 a.m., the Global Navigation Satellite System, GNSS network, managed by Natural Resources Canada, recorded a permanent horizontal displacement of 14 centimeters at the Prince Rupert Harbor Station. This was not a temporary vibration. The North American continent had physically shifted westward in less than a minute. In the windowless operations room of the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, BC, automated algorithms were already screaming. The initial data suggested a strike-slip rupture, but the bathymetric sensors indicated something far more dangerous, a significant vertical component. A massive block of the seafloor had been heaved upward, displacing billions of cubic meters of cold Pacific water. Technically, the Queen Charlotte Fault is often called Canada's San Andreas, but that comparison fails to capture the raw oceanic power of this event. Unlike a land-based fault, this rupture occurred in a complex transpressional zone, where the Pacific plate doesn't just slide past the North American plate, it grinds into it. This creates immense pressure, building over centuries until the rock's internal friction is overcome. Alistair Mackenzie, a senior seismologist with the Geological Survey of Canada, noted in an emergency bulletin, "The shear stress on this segment of the fault has been critical since the 2012 magnitude 7.8 Haida Gwaii event. Today, the log broke completely. We are seeing a rupture length of approximately 90 kilometers along the seafloor, with a vertical displacement of nearly 2 meters in the deepest parts of the Hecate Strait. This displacement is the classic trigger for a local tsunami. By 5:52 a.m., the National Tsunami Warning Center, in coordination with Public Safety Canada, issued an immediate alert for the North Coast, Central Coast, and Haida Gwaii. The telemetry from offshore pressure sensors, dart buoys, confirmed the worst. A wave was already propagating toward the mainland at the speed of a commercial jetliner. The vulnerability of the infrastructure cannot be overstated. In Prince Rupert, the port's massive container terminals at Fairview and the propane export facilities on Ridley Island are built on land reclaimed from the sea or on steep, rocky embankments. High-precision tilt meters at the Kitimat LNG terminal registered a sudden 3-degree shift in ground level, suggesting localized liquefaction of the glacier-marine clays that underlie much of the region's coastal soil. This weak layer of clay acts like a lubricant under high-frequency shaking. As the magnitude 7.4 waves rippled through the earth, the water pressure between soil particles spiked, turning solid ground into a heavy liquid. Reports began to flood in from Highway 16, the Yellowhead Highway, the only land link between Prince Rupert and the rest of Canada. Mass wasting and rockfalls triggered by the tremor had already severed the road in multiple locations between Terrace and Prince Rupert. The rail lines crucial for Canada's supply chain were buckled like plastic ribbons. At 6:15 a.m., a magnitude 5.6 aftershock struck near Port Edward, further destabilizing already compromised structures. The monitoring data showed the crust was not settling, it was fracturing in a cascading sequence. The tension in the scientific community was palpable. This wasn't just an earthquake, it was a systemic failure of a coupled geological system. The crustal rupture at 35 kilometers was deep enough to involve the brittle ductile transition zone, meaning the energy release was sustained and brutal. In the minutes following the main shock, the residents of the North Coast weren't just facing the threat of falling buildings, they were facing a countdown against a rising tide of displaced ocean, as the seafloor scream translated into a wall of water moving toward their harbors. To grasp the sheer inevitability of the 2026 Hecate Strait rupture, one must look into the dark archives of Canada's seismic history. This is not an isolated freak occurrence. It is the latest heartbeat in a violent multi-millennial cycle. The Queen Charlotte Fault, often dubbed Canada's San Andreas, is the most dangerous tectonic boundary in the country, yet it remains hidden beneath the frigid Pacific waters, obscured by the very geography it created. The historical parallels are chilling. On August 22, 1949, this same fault system produced a magnitude 8.1 earthquake, the largest ever recorded in Canadian history. That event was so powerful, it knocked people off their feet in Terrace and was felt as far south as Vancouver and even into the interior of the Yukon. However, in 1949, the North Coast was a frontier of small fishing villages and cannery outposts. Today, the landscape has been transformed into a critical node of global trade, and the physics of a magnitude 7.4 rupture are now colliding with a multi-billion-dollar industrial corridor. More recently, the 2012 Haida Gwaii earthquake, a magnitude 7.8, provided a modern diagnostic of the fault's evolving personality. Before 2012, many geologists believed the Queen Charlotte Fault was purely strike slip, moving sideways. The 2012 event shattered that consensus, revealing a massive thrust component where the Pacific plate is being shoved underneath the islands. Scientists at Natural Resources Canada realized then that the system was coupled in a way that maximizes both shaking and tsunami potential. The April 2, 2026 event confirms this nightmare scenario. By occurring at a shallow depth of 35 kilometers, the rupture bypassed the deeper, more ductile layers of the crust that could have absorbed the energy. Instead, it fractured the brittle upper crustal layers, the cold, rigid rock that snaps like frozen glass. The energy release of a 7.4 is difficult to visualize without statistics that border on the apocalyptic. Using the moment magnitude scale, every single whole number increase represents a 32-fold increase in energy. This means the 2026 event released roughly 65 times the energy of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This energy doesn't just dissipate, it enters the Stickenia terrain, the ancient stiff geological block that forms the foundation of northern British Columbia. This rock is an excellent conductor of seismic waves, allowing the high-frequency vibrations to travel further and with more destructive force than they would in the softer soils of the south. But the real scientific twist in the Hecate Strait is the bathymetry tsunami coupling. Computer models run by the Geological Survey of Canada and the University of Victoria have long warned of fjord resonance. The coastline of British Columbia is a jagged maze of deep, narrow inlets and steep underwater slopes. When the magnitude 7.4 tremor struck, it didn't just displace the sea surface. It destabilized massive, weak layers of glacial-marine sediment perched on the edges of the continental shelf. In a process known as a submarine landslide-triggered tsunami, billions of tons of silt and rock can slump into the deep trenches. These underwater avalanches generate secondary waves that are often more localized but far more vertical and violent than the primary tectonic tsunami. Forecast models indicate that in the narrow confines of the Douglas Channel, the primary shipping lane for the liquefied natural gas (LNG) export facilities, waves could reach heights of 1.5 to 2.5 meters within minutes. This isn't just about height. It's about the sheer mass of water moving at 60 kilometers per hour through a channel less than 3 kilometers wide. The run-up effect means that when this water hits the head of the fjord near the district of Kitimat, it doesn't just stop. It climbs. It flows inland, carrying with it the debris of docks, boats, and shoreline infrastructure. The cyclicity of these events is the most alarming data point. Seismologists have identified that the Queen Charlotte Fault has seismic gaps, segments that haven't ruptured in over a century. The 2026 event occurred in a zone that was heavily stressed by the 2012 and 1949 events, illustrating a process called Coulomb stress transfer. Each major earthquake doesn't just relieve pressure, it pushes the neighboring segments closer to their own breaking point. The April 2nd rupture has now increased the load on the segments near the Dixon entrance to the north and the Scott Islands to the south. The clock hasn't been reset. For these neighboring regions, the hand has moved significantly closer to midnight. We are observing a cascading failure of the Canadian Pacific margin, a geological domino effect where the question isn't if the next segment will fail, but which one will go next. The system is primed, the layers are weakened, and the history of the North Coast is being written in fractures and waves. The human dimension of the April 2nd rupture is a tapestry of split-second decisions and systemic failures. For Marcus Tremblay, a veteran tugboat captain stationed in Prince Rupert's inner harbor, the disaster didn't begin with a sound, but with an impossible sensation. At 5:48 a.m., the hull of his vessel, the Skinner Spirit, was struck by a shock wave so violent he initially thought a freighter had detonated at the Fairview terminal. It wasn't a roll, it was a hammer blow, Tremblay later recounted to investigators from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. The water around the tug started to boil with sediment, and then the harbor just emptied. Tremblay's experience is a textbook account of the drawback phase of a tsunami. As the seafloor faulted, it created a massive trough, sucking the water out of Prince Rupert's harbor with such force that several smaller fishing vessels were grounded on the suddenly exposed mudflats within 90 seconds. 300 kilometers to the south, at the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, Dr. Sunita Rao was the lead seismologist on the graveyard shift. When the magnitude 7.4 hit, her screens didn't just show data. They saturated in a crimson flood of clipping signals. We knew within 40 seconds that this was the big one for the North Coast, Dr. Rao stated. The moment I saw the displacement data from the GNSS station at Digby Island, I knew the alert had to be immediate. There was no room for a second opinion. At 5:51 a.m., she triggered the National Tsunami Warning Center's highest level broadcast. Across northern British Columbia, the alert-ready system took over every cellular device, radio station, and television screen. The piercing multi-tonal siren of the emergency broadcast woke thousands. But for those in the inundation zone, the window for survival was closing. In the village of Lakwalams, Elias Okalik was already awake, preparing for a morning of crabbing. He described the sound of the approaching wave as a low-frequency roar that you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. Having participated in several Great BC shakeout drills, Okalik didn't hesitate. He grabbed his young daughter and ran for the high ground behind the community center. Behind him, the first surge, not a breaking wall of water, but a surging, debris-choked tide, raced into the bay. It obliterated the municipal wharf and swamped the lower-lying coastal homes. The height was measured at 1.8 meters, but the momentum was equivalent to a freight train. The logistics of the disaster were equally devastating. By 6:30 a.m., Public Safety Canada had received reports that Highway 16, the vital Yellowhead artery, was severed in 6 locations. A massive rockfall near Casix had buried over 400 meters of the roadway under thousands of tons of granite. Terrace, the regional hub, was effectively isolated from the coast. Sarah MacDonald, a primary care paramedic in Terrace, described the atmosphere as contained chaos. We had reports of a collapsed warehouse in Prince Rupert with multiple victims, but we couldn't get the ambulances through. The rail line was twisted into S shapes. We were looking at a total isolation protocol for the entire North Coast. The economic impact began to climb immediately. The port of Prince Rupert, Canada's third largest, was forced into an indefinite shutdown. Initial estimates by the Insurance Bureau of Canada placed the structural damage to the Fairview container terminal and the Ridley Island coal and propane facilities at upwards of 2.8 billion Canadian dollars. This doesn't include the daily 150 million Canadian dollars in lost trade as trans-Pacific shipping was diverted or stalled. Critically, the region's telecommunications were gutted. The primary fiber optic cables that run along the seafloor to provide high-speed internet to Haida Gwaii and the North Coast were severed by the primary rupture and subsequent submarine landslides. For hours, the only link to the outside world was via satellite and the amateur radio operators of the Civil Radio Emergency Service. BC Hydro reported that the high-voltage transmission lines serving the Kitimat smelter and the LNG Canada site had tripped as the towers shifted in the liquefied soil. The weak layers of glacier marine clay had performed exactly as geologists feared, turning the foundations of the province's industrial future into a slurry. As the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the coast mountains, it revealed a landscape fundamentally altered, not by the hand of man, but by the relentless indifferent physics of a planet that refuses to stay still. The magnitude 7.4 rupture in the Hecate Strait on April 2, 2026 was not an isolated event. It was a violent recalibration of the North American continent. As the immediate dust settles and the emergency signals of the alert-ready system fall silent, the focus of the Geological Survey of Canada has shifted from rescue to a far more chilling objective: forecasting the next failure. The data gathered from the hundreds of aftershocks, some reaching magnitude 5.8, indicates that the Queen Charlotte Fault is currently in a state of high energy transition. This is the concept of Coulomb stress transfer in its most lethal form. By rupturing a 90-kilometer segment near Prince Rupert, the Earth has not relieved its burden. It has merely shoved that stress further down the line. To the north, toward the Dixon entrance and the Alaskan border, and to the south, toward the Scott Islands and the northern tip of Vancouver Island, the crust is now under more tension than at any point in the last century. The vulnerability of Canada's Pacific infrastructure has been laid bare, and the implications for the next decade are sobering. The port of Prince Rupert and the massive LNG export facilities in Kitimat represent hundreds of billions of dollars in national interest, yet they sit atop a geological powder keg. Scientists at Natural Resources Canada are now closely monitoring the Stikinia block, the rigid tectonic terrain that underpins northern British Columbia. The concern is that the April 2nd event has destabilized the weak layers of marine clay and glacial till that line the fjords. These sediments, often hundreds of meters thick, are susceptible to delayed failure. Even weeks after the initial shaking has stopped, a minor tremor could trigger a catastrophic submarine landslide within the Douglas Channel, creating a displacement wave that would strike industrial docks with virtually zero warning time. The bathymetry of the BC coast is a labyrinth of traps. The deep water conceals slopes that are now structurally compromised, waiting for the final nudge of gravity. Furthermore, the 2026 event has reignited fears regarding the connection between the Queen Charlotte Fault and the Cascadia subduction zone to the south. While separated by the Explorer and Juan de Fuca plates, these systems are tectonically coupled. A major rupture in the north changes the torque on the entire margin. The big one, the long-anticipated magnitude 9.0 megathrust earthquake off the coast of Vancouver Island, remains the ultimate threat, and the Hecate Strait rupture may have acted as a systemic nudge. The Integrated Rapid Visual Screening (IRVS) of bridges, schools, and hospitals across British Columbia now requires a total overhaul. Engineers must account for the fact that the ground acceleration recorded on April 2nd exceeded the 1 in 2,475-year design earthquake standards in several coastal zones. Our built environment was designed for a version of the Earth that no longer exists. The ecological consequences are equally profound and enduring. The seafloor displacement has altered the local underwater topography, potentially disrupting the migratory paths of salmon and the delicate deep-sea glass sponge reefs of the Hecate Strait, a unique Canadian treasure found nowhere else on Earth. The sediment plumes kicked up by the earthquake have suffocated vast areas of the seafloor, and the long-term impact on the North Coast biodiversity remains a variable that researchers at Fisheries and Oceans Canada are only beginning to quantify. The reality that policymakers must now confront is that the tectonic clock in the North Pacific is accelerating. The period of relative seismic quiet that allowed for the rapid industrialization of the North Coast is over. The data suggests we have entered a new epoch of heightened activity, a seismic storm that could last for decades. The logistical corridors, the rail lines through the Skeena Valley and Highway 16, are now proven points of failure. Future planning for the region must move beyond traditional disaster response and toward a model of tectonic resilience. This means building power grids with automated decoupling sensors, constructing tsunami-resistant shipping berths, and perhaps most importantly, recognizing that the geological forces at work are indifferent to human economic cycles. The Queen Charlotte Fault does not negotiate. It does not wait for a budget cycle or a convenient time to move. It is a relentless machine, driven by the slow, cooling core of our planet, moving with the momentum of billions of tons of lithospheric plate. The event of April 2, 2026 was a warning shot, a demonstration of the raw kinetic power stored just kilometers beneath our feet. For the communities of Haida Gwaii, Prince Rupert, and Kitimat, the normal they knew has been replaced by a state of constant, data-driven vigilance. We cannot stop the plates from moving, nor can we predict the exact second the next fracture will occur. We can only follow the